I've been testing out the iPad Pro and the iPad Air for quite a while now, and I think that it's finally time to deliver on that full comparison that I kept promising you all. Both of these are incredibly similar, that they are still different enough to warrant a proper comparison. So which one should you actually get, the iPad Air or the iPad Pro? Let's go ahead and dive right in. Before we continue, I just want to remind you that we have a Twitch channel where we stream every Friday and Saturday from 8 p.m. and to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, so why not go ahead and drop a follow? And also don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and also make sure to check out the merch store. There's plenty of black and white sweetness to choose from up there, so go ahead and check that out. And then make sure to take a look at the podcast as well, as the podcast always goes live every Wednesday and Sunday. And with that said, enough rambling, let us get straight into the video. So let's begin with a comparison of the exterior design here. From the front, both of these are going to look identical at first glance, but looking a little bit closer, you're going to notice that the iPad Pro does have slightly thinner bezels than the iPad Air. On the back, you're going to also notice that I'm using the iPad Pro from 2018 as my example, since there are hardly any differences between the 2018 and the 2020 models, and you can really take my thoughts from the 2018 model and apply them to the 2020 model for the most part. And FYI, that is just going to be the case, and I don't really have the 2020 model on me at this time, so I can't really show it in the footage. However, this is still a very apt comparison, but these will look identical around the rear as well, both featuring the same aluminum backplate that feels very premium and the same boxy design for the corners. You will also find the same buttons configuration all across, as well as the placement for the magnetic latch for the Apple Pencil, which is going to be on the exact same side for both devices. The only other real difference between the two comes in the form of authentication. The iPad Pro was known for ditching the fingerprint scanner in favor of Face ID, and the iPad Air actually brings back Touch ID like it's nothing, but it does come in exchange for all of those scanners and sensors that made Face ID possible in the first place. So no Face ID on the iPad Air 4 or iPad Air 2020, as it is otherwise known as. But they are very similar in terms of their design and even share the exact same footprint. And in terms of their displays, the iPad Pro has an 11-inch display with the option of getting the larger model with a 12.9-inch display, and the iPad Air features a 10.9-inch display that is slightly smaller than the iPad Pros due to the thicker bezels. And they both share the same resolution display, at least almost the same resolution display, with the iPad Air being off by a few pixels really. And I'm talking about 1668 by 2388 on the iPad Pro and 1640 by 2360 on the iPad Air. It's very negligible. The differences are nearly impossible to notice regarding resolution. Both displays are very beautiful, and watching content as well as making content with either display is going to honestly be a pretty great experience for my experience. However, the biggest difference between the two will be the fact that the iPad Pro has a 120Hz display and the iPad Air has a 60Hz display. And that's what makes the biggest difference here in a lot of ways. In terms of usability, the iPad Pro does feel more smooth to use in general, since the screen naturally runs at double the frame rate than what you would get from the iPad Air. However, if you look at them entirely separately, you won't notice much of a difference here. However, again, it is still worth noting, and this is actually going to be a very important piece of comparison as we move on forward with testing different types of software and things like that. And now, when it comes to speakers, the iPad Pro objectively has the better set of speakers. The iPad Pro has 4 speakers and the iPad Air has 4 speaker grills, but actually only 2 active speakers, which are going to be the ones on the bottom. There is a difference in loudness for sure, and in terms of depth as well, so go ahead and have a listen here.
I've been an advocate of cloud gaming for quite a while now, with services like Stadia constantly trying to improve their service, and GeForce Now having such a strong start already. However, I would still consider cloud gaming to be for a more niche audience, I would say. And while I sometimes like playing some games this way, what keeps me doing it so often is the fact that I didn't really have a comfortable way of playing on my phone, for instance. And in terms of usability, I've been an advocate of cloud gaming for quite a while now, with services like Stadia constantly trying to improve their service and GeForce Now having such a strong start already. However, I would still consider cloud gaming to be for a more niche audience, I would say. And while I sometimes like playing some games this way, what keeps me doing it so often is the fact that I didn't really have a comfortable way of playing on my phone, for instance.
And when it comes to battery life, the numbers are pretty similar. I would say at least I just haven't noticed much of a difference between the two. They seem to have the same size battery, and battery performance in general seems to be really about the same regardless of what I'm doing. When it comes to editing and more intensive work, obviously battery life will certainly drop more significantly as you move forward with those tasks, and the iPad Pro does lose more energy more quickly in this instance, but I would argue that battery life isn't something really to be too concerned about when it comes to choosing whether you want to go with the iPad Pro or with the iPad Air, because the differences, at the very least from my testing, are going to be more negligible than not. But the iPad Air does have better battery life between the two in the grand scheme of things, and if I had to pick a winner here, it would be the iPad Air. And now let's get into straight up performance, but let's begin with something a little bit more lighthearted like gaming. In a game like Asphalt 9, you will have a smooth gaming experience no matter what. The iPad Air feels very smooth to play on at 60Hz, and trust me, you won't even question it. But if you're gaming on the iPad Pro, you will feel that difference from 60Hz to 120Hz because it's literally double the refresh rate, and that really does make a difference, especially when it comes to games. You're just going to be a lot more adept at telling the difference between these, since it'll just feel more responsive in general. While I can say that I did have a better gaming experience on the iPad Pro, I should not ignore the fact that the iPad Air is still a fantastic performer in this regard, and I still had a great time playing games on it without a doubt. And now let's go ahead and talk about overall drawing performance. So yeah, we are delving into the more professional side of things here. In terms of performance, in apps like Procreate, Sketchbook, Clip Studio, and more, you are going to get a very solid experience regardless of which iPad you end up going with or what software you end up using. And I would argue that it doesn't really matter in this case which one you go for. I'd be hard-pressed to not only make a distinction in terms of performance, but also just in terms of smoothness, because really you're not going to notice that 120Hz refresh rate if you're just drawing on that display, if that display is already running at something like 60, that already feels really smooth for drawing. So quite frankly, it's probably not really going to bother you. I think that both of these are going to be great for animators and 2D artists in general. So if you're looking to save a decent chunk of cash, then the iPad Air will not disappoint in this regard. I really don't think so. Responsiveness with the iPad Air is identical, I would say, unless you really stretch it to say that the 120Hz display really makes that much of a difference. It doesn't for me, because it really is hard to notice when you're just drawing, really. Not to mention that either iPad will handle all of these programs that I just mentioned above perfectly well without any performance issues that I can possibly point out. So yeah, there's that. However, when it comes to doing some 3D work or 3D modeling on either iPad, that's when you will notice a difference regarding the refresh rate. However, it's still really not that important either way, because you are moving the camera around a lot in this instance. It just feels more smooth to work on the iPad Pro versus the iPad Air. But this has nothing to do with specs, besides the obvious advantage that the Pro has with that refresh rate on that display. That's not to say that it feels sluggish to do 3D work on the iPad Air at all, because it does still feel very, very smooth. You're still using that program at 60 frames per second, which is still a pretty high refresh rate. It should not be ignored, even if 120 is going to be a lot better. Now, performance is still great, and something like Forger, for instance, which is actually the software that I've been using to make this test, if you want to do 3D work, having these side by side, I wouldn't want to compromise and go for the Air personally, since I do feel like the higher refresh rate, it adds to the experience of modeling on the software, but most modelers still work on 60Hz displays anyway, so it probably really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, and the program still runs very well on the iPad Air. So ultimately, the choice really depends on your budget in this case and your priorities here, but if I were to pick which one I got for 3D modeling specifically, I'd say that the boost in that refresh rate does make a difference, and it just makes 3D modeling feel smoother, even if it technically isn't much smoother, because they're pretty close when it comes to specs, for the exception of that more updated CPU for the iPad Air. And now let's talk about video editing in LumaFusion. Both of these are still great performers without a doubt, and either one can edit 4K videos like nothing. This is all from experience, of course. I will admit, however, that the difference in the refresh rate is a little more obvious to me on this software, since I actually use a 120Hz screen to edit on DaVinci Resolve, so I'm just so used to doing work in 120Hz that when I edited 4K footage on the iPad Air, I did feel like it was a little slower just working on the timeline, for instance. However, this is still a special case, and what makes this comparison difficult is literally the fact that they both handle anything that you throw at them incredibly well. Not just when it comes to video editing software, but when it comes to all other types of software like photo editing and drawing and animating, and all of these things are just handled so beautifully by both devices. I can honestly guarantee that if they both had the same refresh rate, it would feel exactly the same to work on either one. However, rendering performance is another beast of its own, and since the iPad Air has more recent hardware, at the very least a more updated, more recent CPU, it is going to be a little bit faster when it comes to rendering performance, at the very least from my experience. But the differences are still, again, going to be negligible if anything. But this is compared to the 2018 iPad Pro. I do have a friend that has the 2020 iPad Pro, and he reports performance to be really about the same as well, so there really isn't that much to report on here. Okay, so here's my conclusion. It is my opinion that the iPad Pro is the better device between the two. Whether you get the 2018 or the 2020 model, it is a better experience when it comes to the vast majority of tasks, and if you look at the used market, the 2018 iPad Pro can be found for some pretty neat prices too. However, if we wanted to talk about the iPad Pro 2020 and the iPad Air, the 2020 model that is, then that's where the real differences in price lie. I really like the iPad Air for what it is, and I think that for $600, this is the way to go, especially if you are a student, because I understand what it's like to be a college student and only really having so much money to spend on gadgets like these, even though you do need a relatively powerful gadget, just something to take you through school. I think that an iPad is starting to become one of the best options out there. And if I were still in school, I would have bought the iPad Air without thinking about it twice. Really, and I still stand by that. However, if you're looking for something with greater longevity, then the iPad Pro will age better due to the higher refresh rate. However, in terms of specs, there really wasn't much to compare here, because all of the iPads mentioned in this video were really fantastic performers, and I really have no complaints performance-wise when it comes to either one of these, with everything and anything tossed at them, that is. So here's my verdict. Get the iPad Pro if money isn't an issue, but get the iPad Air if it is. And honestly, if you're just a student, save yourself the extra cash. Save yourself those $200 that you would be spending on that higher refresh rate, because you might find it to not necessarily be worth it to you. The iPad Air is perfectly fine as it is, and it is a great budget alternative. In fact, it's the only budget alternative on iOS that I would recommend right now. But if you are a professional, I would stick with the iPad Pro in general, obviously. And that is essentially my verdict. So if you are interested in purchasing either one of these, and I'll be making sure to leave a few links down to Amazon in the description, and you're also going to get the option for Luster, which is going to be a pretty cool service that is going to help you find sales on any one of these items. So I definitely recommend that you go ahead and install that, because having the ability of just having Luster showing you wherever there are sales, like not just on Amazon, but it could be pretty much anywhere else, is going to be super helpful, so that it can help you save some money along the way. So I do recommend that as well. And if you are interested in getting any one of these tablets but don't want to pay for it outright, or if you just feel like it's a lot of money to spend all at once, which I totally get, then there is going to be the option of a bundle, which is going to be a financing service where you don't need your own credit card at all. It'll just let you pay in installments as is, and it's not the same thing as applying for a credit card by any means. It's going to be way easier, much simpler, and less risky than that. So I strongly recommend that you go with that option if you're trying to maybe pay a little bit more slowly as well. If you use any of these links, links, I get a small commission that does help out the channel quite a bit, so I would appreciate that quite a bit. And also do make sure to stop by the Tech Summit podcast. It does go live every week. We tend to talk about tech. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of those episodes and turn on that notification bell. And also do make sure to stop by my Twitch, as I do stream every Friday and Saturday, and usually every time that I do a microphone review, I tend to stream with that same microphone so that you guys can hear what it's like to stream with it. Links to that down below, as well as links to my other social media stuff like my Instagram and my Twitter. But with that said, this has been Francisco from Tech Summit. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be seeing you all later. Enjoy.